Now I would like to introduce the speaker, John Kiser, who wrote the book Commander of the Faithful, The Life and Times of Emir Abd el-Kader, and this talk will be about the book. John Kiser has degrees from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Columbia, and Chicago, University of Chicago, mainly in history, but he worked as a businessman for a long while. Then he came back to writing history. In fact, he has a very interesting series of books. One of them is on French character Stefan Zweig, Death of a Modern Man. It's an award-winning book. And then he started writing a book on French rule in Algeria. And while doing that research, it requires an entrepreneurial skill to come up with the current topic in the midst of all this hype about jihad and martyrdom in the post-September 11 world. John Kiser wrote a book about a character whose life teaches us a lot about what jihad and martyrdom meant in history, almost 150 years ago, which became a very successful book. So without further introductions, please welcome John Kiser to the book.
Cups, do you, Samuel?
Yes, a little much.
I don't like drinking out of a bottle publicly in front of
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, including me in your fall of the book week. It's a double entendre, perhaps, right? Fall of the book. The digital age, making books more and more uncommon. I was asked by Samuel to present an argument. What was my argument in this book? And I said to him, actually, I didn't think of the book as an argument. I thought of it as simply an effort to revive the memory of a man who was one of the great men of the 19th century, who was known from Missouri to Paris to Moscow to Mecca between the years of 1830 and 1875. So I like recovering lost history. I also like adventure, and for me, writing about Emir Abd el-Kader was a great spiritual adventure, political adventure, physical adventure. But what's the argument? I'll tell you very briefly the argument, and then we'll get into who he was. The argument is very simple. We need stories about good Muslims today. In a world where our perceptions are largely determined by the media, and in a media which obviously prefers violence and bloodshed to peace and harmony, which is boring, we have had essentially our minds have been hijacked by the media because of its obsession with violence. So what do we see when we think about Islam? And if you're not already educated, we see a picture of a violent faith, a violent religion, people who are frightening. So in one sense, the book was an argument that yes, or no, no, not all Muslims are what you think. His life belies some major false perceptions or incomplete perceptions that are popular among people who are essentially uninformed. One is the notion that Muslims hate Christians. It comes in part from translations of the Quran in which many bad things are said about non-believers. The footnotes aren't in the Quran that explain that non-believers do not include Christians and Jews and other faiths which submit to God. A non-believer is somebody who's essentially a pagan. But Christians are generally thought to be among the non-believers if they read the Quran and haven't actually been instructed in what the Quran means, what the original language said. Another perception, of course, is that jihad, a holy and sacred word, is about violence and bloodshed and permanent war against the non-Islamic world. This is a story of a man who was a warrior, a statesman, a scholar, a poet, a philosopher, and in many ways, a saintly person. What inspired me to take 6 years of my life to write about this man? Well, one is I was very drawn by his intellect. He was a kind of a Vatican II Muslim, 150 years before Vatican II was announced by Pope John XXIII, in which the Church declared that actually Christianity doesn't own God. The Emir had a view of religion and God that appealed to me and made me want to learn more about this man. If God is what the different communities believe, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, the Zoroastrians, the polytheists, he is that, and he is still more. If God is what the prophets and the angels and saints say, he is that, and more. None of his creatures worship him in his entirety. No one is an infidel in all the ways relating to God. All of his creatures worship him in some ways and are ignorant of him in other ways. There is no error in the world except in a relative manner. We're all wrong. The infinite cannot grasp, the finite cannot grasp the infinite. God is beyond understanding, and no religion encompasses the infinite truth of God. To me, this is a statement which I received from a Catholic nun in Algiers that was both rational, humble, and inclusive. The forms of worship may change, but the Master is one. So, I liked his spirit, I liked his mind. He was a unifier, not a divider. And for the Emir, his religion was not a safety belt that he clung to for security, but rather a platform for exploring and understanding the glory of God's creation. So, Abd el-Kader, Kader, one of the 99 words for God, the force, the doer, the enabler. He was a servant of God. That's a pretty heavy name to carry around, to live up to. But he came pretty close to succeeding. Before I sent my manuscript to the publisher 3 years ago, I sent it to a Deobandi scholar in Pakistan, Muhammad Khan Nasser, editor of Al-Sharia magazine. And I figured, being a Pakistani, he would not have any big biases, and being conservative, his judgment of this man's validity as a model to be held up to other Muslims would perhaps confirm or at least validate my own instincts that this is a man who needs to be rediscovered. Here's what he said, just a few lines that made me feel that perhaps I was on the right track. I had a chance to minutely study your book, The Life of Emir Abd el-Kader. In my opinion, it is significantly relevant to what is going on in the world today, especially the Muslim world. Abd el-Kader is not only a symbol of the Muslim concept of resistance and struggle against foreign domination, but also an embodiment of the true theological, moral, and rational ideas taught by Islam. So what did he do? An overview of his life could be simply put as a life of struggle. Struggle against the French resistance, struggle against despair in prison in France, struggle to live in exile, and to struggle for justice throughout his life. His whole life was a struggle to live righteously in a way that was pleasing to God in accordance to Islamic law as he understood it. He was blessed with an excellent education, born in 1808 in what is today Western Algeria, then a beylik of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, near Mascara, born into a Sufi family, a father who was well educated and much revered for his wisdom and his generosity, his reputation as a peacemaker and reconciler. He had an extraordinary education, even by our standards today. In fact, I would say much better than what we get today, because his education was kind of a combination of that of a Benedictine monk, a Marine, and a good liberal arts education, maybe George Mason. He had to learn the arts of survival in the desert. He was a man of the desert, born into a Marabutic tribe, the tribes who are not specialists in warfare, but specialists in peace and reconciliation and learning. Nevertheless, he still had to learn the art of the hunt and how to survive in the desert. So he was an outstanding rider, marksman. He could find water in the desert. He could identify tribes by their tents, the type of raptors they used, and so forth. By the time he was 12, he was a Hafiz, which means that he had memorized the Quran by heart. And a few years later, he was a Talib, meaning he was qualified to instruct others. His father wasn't satisfied, however, with his just having a mastery of religious knowledge, which of course was a foundation for everything else. He wanted him to be educated in the worldly subjects. So he sent him to special tutors where he learned mathematics, astronomy, pharmacology, history, philosophy. He read Plato, Aristotle, the Arab classics, Ibn Khaldun, and so forth. He was what we might call today a broadly educated person in the Renaissance tradition. But that wasn't enough. His father wanted him to have more than book knowledge. He wanted him to see the world in its diversity and complexity. So this young scholar who lived in a tiny village in the middle of nowhere was sent to Oran, the big evil city, the New York of Western Algeria, where he saw life in greater complexity. He was taken by his father at the age of 18 on a 4-year Hajj. It took him to Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and ultimately Mecca. And throughout that experience, he saw different forms of Muslims. He saw Druze. He saw Jews who were different from the Jews back home, different kinds of Christians. He saw this great diversity which he tried to square with, how do you square the oneness of God with the diversity of his creation, one of his obsessions. When he came back in 1828 from this long absence, news had circulated around about the French insult. perhaps I should say the Turkish insult to the French. In 1828, the day of Algiers, got into a contretemps with the French ambassador over past debts that were owed to the Algerian government by France, deliveries of wheat, supplies to Napoleon's armies, provided by a Jewish firm of traders. Insisting on being paid at least interest on this back debt, being told by the French ambassador that kings don't respond to days. He took umbrage, slapped the French consul in the face with his fly whisk, and 2 years later the French had an excuse to send a fleet to Algiers in an episode of gunboat diplomacy that unwittingly led them into what became a 132-year war. The Battle of Algiers was not in 1956. The Battle of Algiers, the real Battle of Algiers, was in 1830, because that's when the Long War began. And the first phase of the Long War was fought principally by Emir Abd el-Kader, the most wily and resilient and audacious of the various Arab chieftains the French had to contend with. For 15 years, from 1832 to 1847, the Emir defied many of Napoleon's best generals who were sent to Algiers to pacify the country and to seize Abd el-Kader. Throughout that period, he won admirers both among the French and among observers from abroad. One of his admirers was an American lawyer by the name of Timothy Davis, in little old Dubuque, Iowa. Timothy Davis admired him because he was a freedom fighter, a David fighting a French Goliath, known for an honorable character, a man who could be trusted, and a man who fought in a way that would put Americans to shame today. He fought in a Quranically or Islamically correct manner. What is that? There are rules of Quranic warfare, although actually I guess they're Islamic since they're not embedded in the Quran, but they were developed by the caliphs, Abu Bakr in particular, which made it easier to subdue enemies by treating them well. So there's a set of rules which are generally not followed, but which he insisted on following and forcing upon his lieutenants to follow, that impressed French prisoners and impressed the world. What are those rules of Islamic warfare? You don't destroy nature gratuitously. Orchards, fields. You don't even cut down a nice shade tree. You do not mutilate dead bodies. You do not shoot someone in the face, which is the image of God. You do not harm prisoners. You do not kill the innocents or shoot monks or priests unless they're armed. The Emir's two greatest weapons in a struggle that he was doomed to lose once the French decided they were serious about staying in Algeria. First 10 years of the struggle, they couldn't decide what they wanted to do. And his Jewish network of traders and sort of intelligence system kept him constantly informed of what was going on in Paris, the vacillations and support for lack of support for their struggle, attitudes in France, negotiations that were going on among the French, they knew lots of things because the Jews that he worked with were diplomats who were his interlocutors with the French. He always seemed to know what the French were up to. But his greatest weapon, the one most feared that the French couldn't do anything about, was his humanity. During the midst of total war in 1841, when a French general by the name of Joe decided that, take the gloves off, we're going to wage scorched earth warfare against all the tribes that support the Emir, burn, destroy, scatter. In the midst of this stage of his struggle against the French, he institutes the first prisoner exchanges. And in a way that's quite remarkable. The Bishop of Algiers, one Alphonse de Pouche, a sympathetic man, soft-hearted man, wanted to do good for Arabs and Christians alike, received a visit one night from a desperate woman with a child in her hand. Her husband was a captive in the Emir's clutches, and she came to his home one night, a rainy night, it says in the documents, beseeching the bishop to do something. Please, do something. Get the Emir to release my husband. I am alone, a poor woman with a single child, a single woman with a single child. He sends his emissary out to the Emir with a note. The Emir receives it. He knows of Depuche. He's a man of God. He has a reputation for doing good works. And he says to the emissary, why is he only asking for one of his prisoners to be released? Why doesn't he want all the French prisoners released? And doesn't his book say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Why doesn't he release our Arabs that he has, or the French have in Algiers? Why don't we have an exchange of equal number? Well, this was flabbergasting. Depuche goes to Bugeaud and says, look, what's happened? The Emir is willing to exchange prisoners. Bugeaud is not happy. Not happy at all. Because the French have been busy demonizing their adversary, a savage, a barbarian. If the soldiers surrender, they'll be decapitated or worse. So this was top secret information that had to stay in very close circles, which it did. The worst thing that could happen would be for the word to get out that the Emir treated his prisoners well. Later in that year, he did another extraordinary thing. He enforced rules on the treatment of prisoners, which were unprecedented in the desert. He told his men they would no longer be allowed, in fact, they would be severely punished if there were reports of them mistreating prisoners taken on the battlefield. And of course, the most common form of mistreating a prisoner taken on the battlefield in the desert was to chop their head off. Who wants prisoners in the desert? Who wants to take care of them? Plus, the system of compensation the Arab warrior depended on was head count. How many heads do you bring back in your saddlebag determines your percentage of the booty. Uproar, protests. How can you do this to us? The Emir, being a man of the law, being a man who always does things in a way that he conforms to what is legal, Islamically speaking, goes to the ulama in Morocco. That's their opinion. Correct. Yes, it's correct. So how are you going to reward us, Emir? How are you going to reward us? Well, I'm going to reward you by giving you 25 strokes on the bottom of your feet if you are reported to mistreat a prisoner. But I also reward you with 8 duros, a Spanish denomination, which I'm told might be worth 15 francs, but how much that was worth in those days, I don't know. But nevertheless, it was a goodly sum of money. So with the carrot and stick approach, he enforced upon his men an ethic of not mistreating prisoners. Shocking, frightening. Another secret that the French at command had to keep tightly guarded. So, a few more years roll by, 1847, the French have decided that they're there to stay. They have over 100,000 troops in Algiers, in Algeria, then it become Algeria. And the Emir understands that God's will must have changed. Objective conditions no longer merited continuing the struggle. There's a verse in the Quran that indicates that God does not approve of pain, useless suffering. Families would have died, horses, animals perished if they continued. So, despite objections of some of his lieutenants, who wanted to carry on a sort of bitter end struggle, he instead negotiated with the French a deal. He voluntarily surrendered to the Duc d'Aumale, who at the time was Crown Prince, one of Louis Philippe's sons, at that time Governor General of Algiers, and General Lamoisière, a respected French general who understood Arab ways and was regarded as an honorable man who treated people fairly and could be trusted. So he makes a deal in which he lays down his arms in return for free passage to the Middle East. He and all his lieutenants and anybody who wants to go to Acre, Mecca, somewhere over there, the Muslim territory. The French are thrilled. After 15 years, they finally got their man, and he did it voluntarily. But once his boat stops in Toulon for refueling on the way to somewhere, they're not sure where, the French have a little change of government, one of many that would occur. The change of government meant that the deal was annulled. Successive governments, wary of a very hostile public opinion towards the Emir, who had been depicted over the years as a savage barbarian, not meriting honorable treatment, threw him in prison and his 100-odd family members. And for 5 years they languished in prisons which actually looked pretty good from the outside because they were royal chateaus. Pau, where Henry IV was born and raised. Amboise, in the Loire, owned in fact by the family of Louis Philippe. So he was staying in pretty nice surroundings, but nevertheless, his freedom had been taken, he'd been betrayed, and he won much respect by his irrepressible diplomatic politesse and diplomatic abilities in dealing with the French. Complaining about his condition and his betrayal, he always spoke to France's higher nature, the good France, not the bad France. He was extraordinarily stoic yet patient, understanding that France's own house was burning. They were having horrible political problems of their own. And most of all, he resisted the blandishments of the war ministry to seduce him into staying in France so they could be let off the hook and not honor this agreement that they had made by persuading the emir to accept vast domains with baths and mosques and horses and harems and so on. But as he said to one of his handlers, you could fill my robe with diamonds and I would throw them into the sea. He wanted only one thing, for France to honor its word, that he would die, rather die, than let them off the hook and to return to a Muslim country. (1852), Louis Napoleon III, finally liberates him. But during that time, he had a horse named after him in England, grand champion of the national steeplechase, 1851, 1852, was Little Ab, Abd el-Kader. The citizens of Bordeaux had voted him in, had written his name on the ballot for the presidential election, 1848. He had seduced hundreds of visitors with his charm, his curiosity, his interest in France, his learning, and his extraordinary generosity towards those around him who had been helpful. The little man who made the coffee filter, the coffin makers who buried his 25 family members who died during the 5-year period, 4.5 year period. Giving pieces of his clothing to admirers. The last phase of his life was spent in Damascus. It was in Damascus that he rose above all of his former opponents and won moral victory that made him a figure of such stature. He was honored by President Lincoln, Queen Victoria, Pius IX, Emir Shamil, the French Freemasons. And what was that? Here's a man who had been invaded by Christians, since all the French were considered Christians, even if most of them weren't. Here's a man who had been betrayed by the French, by Christians. Yet ends up saving the lives of thousands of Christians being attacked by a crazed mob incited by the Turkish Pasha in the 1860s to punish them for failing to pay taxes, being uppity, and all kinds of other issues that came to a head. He saved Christian lives. And what he said during this incident is worth, I think, repeating. We know what he said because his biographer was Charles Henry Churchill. He was the great-great-uncle of Winston Churchill. He was a British military observer who had been one of his many admirers over the years, particularly for his military exploits. And on his way to Damascus, he had been invited to Churchill's home in the Lebanon, where he was taking care of Druze, in the sense of he was their patron, and asked the emir if he could take down his life story, write his biography. And the emir agreed. So for an hour a day for 6 months, the emir told this story. July 9th, 1860, tensions that have been building in Lebanon for 6 months finally burst out in Damascus. The plot, to be sure, but the details of which aren't important. But what is interesting is that the emir, in this case, was confronting not the Christian enemy, but the Muslim enemy. The enemy of Muslim ignorance. Muslim ignorance of the law, of how they're expected to behave. The emir wanted to be a reformer because he knew, felt that Islam was dying from neglect, ignorance, and the bad example that had been set by the Turks in North Africa over the last 100-odd years. The emir turned his home into kind of a refuge for all the embassies, the European embassies. Russian, American, French, British diplomats were there. And then over the course of several days, he had sent his troops out into the Christian quarter of Damascus to bring them into his rather ample home that had been provided by the Turkish government. By the third day, there were hundreds of Christians inside his home. A mob appeared at the door. "Give us the Christians! Give us the Christians! You can keep the diplomats, but we want the Christians." Are you idiots? Are you idiots? Don't you know the law? My brothers, your behavior violates the law of God. What makes you think you have the right to go around killing innocent people? Have you sunk so low that you are slaughtering women and children? Didn't God say in our holy book, whoever kills a man who has never committed murder or created disorder in the land will be regarded as a murderer of all humanity? Give us the Christians! We want the Christians! Didn't God say there should be no constraint in religion? Oh, holy warrior, we don't want your advice. Why do you stick your nose in our business? You've killed Christians yourself. How can you oppose us for avenging their insults? You are like the infidels yourself. Hand over those you are protecting, or you will be punished the same as those you are hiding. You are fools, says the emir. The Christians I killed were invaders and occupiers who were ravaging our country. These have done nothing. If acting against God's law doesn't frighten you, then think about the punishment you will receive from them. It will be terrible. I promise. If you will not listen to me, then God didn't provide you with reason. You are like animals who are aroused only by the sight of grass and water. They lacked aql. One of the things that distinguishes the emir's character is the extent to which he manifested the four virtues, which Christians used to call the cardinal virtues. But these are the four virtues of his particular Sufi taqiyya. Intellect. But the Arab word is much more interesting than intellect. Intellect doesn't really say much, kind of dry, like just good brain power. Aql is mind and spirit. It's the ability to distinguish truth from falseness. It's good judgment, good memory, finesse, discernment, and openness to the wisdom that comes from above. But clearly these men didn't have the ability to discern, to make distinctions between Christians who had done nothing and Christians who had killed and ravaged people in his country 20 years earlier. It's a familiar kind of problem that we have today. The emir also had moral courage, the second of the four virtues. Moral courage is defined in his tradition the same as in the Christian tradition, which is the ability to direct or restrain anger in a proper way. Here he was both restraining and directing, and taking some great risk to do so. Moral courage. Equity, just decency in dealing with people. Justice. And finally, self-restraint. You can't be just if you can't control your passions. You can't be just if you're full of anger, envy, pride. And self-restraint is one of the most powerful and impressive of the characteristics that the Emir displayed over his whole life. He had many reasons to be bitter and angry, not only towards the French, but towards the tribes which betrayed him during his 15-year struggle. Unexpected boulders and disappointments thrown in his path over the years, betrayal. Yet he never allowed anger, hatred, and the spirit of revenge to dominate his spirit. He was a man who ultimately understood that God is above all merciful. And that's what God's creatures are ultimately expected to be, ultimately. In fact, I would say the Emir demonstrates to an extraordinary degree the wisdom of the phrase in the New Testament. I don't know how many of you read the New Testament or even are Christians, but whether you're a Christian or not doesn't make any difference, because a Muslim would agree just as much with the sentiment expressed by Peter in his second letter to his co-religionists, in which he says, add to faith virtue. Faith alone is not enough. You know, I have faith, you know, well, okay, but you have to behave in the way your faith demands. Otherwise, you know, you're like a lawyer who will work for anybody. To virtue, you have to add knowledge. If you're going to say you're a person of faith, a person of the book, you have to know the book. Do you know what's expected of you? Have you done your homework? Do you study what the law is? Because if you don't, again, you're like a lawyer who says, oh, I love the law, but actually, I haven't read the Constitution for years, and I just sort of skim through Blackwell, and you don't know the law very well. Which is what most of us are like, who profess to be, who profess with the lips. The Emir was a man of deep knowledge and learning, and he applied it. To knowledge, you have to add perseverance, to persevere in your faith. It's one thing to be a fair weather friend. It's another thing to retain your faith in adversity. And to perseverance, loving kindness, and charity. Faith, knowledge, virtue, self-restraint, perseverance. These are all qualities that the Emir demonstrated throughout his life. His whole life was a life of jihad. It was a physical jihad, but mostly it was an inner combat. A jihad which all of us should be waging, even if we call it something differently. How do we improve ourselves? How do we become better people? By working on those things the Catholics used to call the 7 deadly sins. You knew about them. We all know about them. But who of us work diligently to control them? So the Emir was a person who not only had the faith, he lived the faith. He executed what was expected of him. He did his duty not necessarily because he was a nice guy and loved his fellow man, but because this is what his sultan expected of him. Indeed, when he responds to Bishop Pavi, the Bishop of Algiers, who sends a letter praising his behavior, thanking him for saving all these Christians, he says in response, "What we did for the Christians, we did to be faithful to Islamic law and out of respect for human rights. All creatures are part of God's family, and those most loved by God are those who do the most good for his family. All the religions of the book rest on two principles: to praise God and to have compassion for his creatures. The law of Muhammad places the greatest importance on compassion and mercy, and all that which preserves social cohesion and protects us from division. But those who belong to the religion of Muhammad have corrupted it, which is why they are now like lost sheep. Thank you for your prayers and goodwill toward me." So even before Muhammad Abdu came along, who famously said, this is the reformer from Egypt and forerunner of the Egyptian Brotherhood, I guess, maybe, who famously said, "I have been to the West, where I see Islam, but no Muslims. And I go to the East, where I see Muslims, but no Islam." He saw that Islam was dying for lack of true Muslims, of real Muslims. And that's perhaps why some of the responses that I received from teachers and administrators who subsequently, I forgot to say earlier that this gentleman, Mr. Nasser, finishes his little resume by saying that he hopes the book is published in English, translated into Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Well, it has since been published in Urdu, and this past April, a two-day workshop was held in Lahore in which madrasa teachers and administrators discussed the Emir's life, this story that I have outlined perhaps in too much detail. But nevertheless, they have reflected on this man's life as a model to be considered for what it means to live as a good Muslim and to live a life of continuous jihad, real jihad. And here's what some of the comments were from the students, and the students who were actually administrators. They were senior people reflecting on how this story can be useful in madrasa education. The objectives of the workshop were summarized as to build capacity for the participants to communicate the multidimensional meaning of the word jihad, enhance their ability of teaching their disciples the real objectives of jihad, help them understand Abd el-Kader's philosophy of jihad, and enable them to answer the question why the world considers Abd el-Kader as a hero and true mujahid, in spite of the fact that he'd been engaged with fighting the French armies. Some other comments just summarized by Mr. Nasser from students. We never knew that we had such great jihadists who are being regarded as heroes in the West. We should learn more about him and encourage our students to follow jihadists like the Emir and not Osama. After all these 2 days, another student, I personally feel that we have lost the true soul of jihad. What we've been teaching to our students about jihad and jihadists are completely different from what a true jihad was. Students are also reading about him in Iowa because Americans also need to see a different face of Islam. And the fact that Americans in Iowa are reading this book, and the prize has been offered for the best essay It explains why his life deserves to be resuscitated and revived, and what meaning does his life have for the student. That fact in itself is a very positive, reinforcing piece of information to Muslims who wonder whether this is just medicine for them. Is it we trying to actually weaken their fighting spirit by holding up the image of a man who surrendered voluntarily? Thank you.
We have 10 minutes for questions, 10, 15.